Up next, we have our first panel of the day and our last session of the morning. We have four highly respected thought leaders in both cannabis and psychedelics, and they're going to be comparing and contrasting these two worlds. As we set up the stage and they take the stage, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ricardo Baca. Ricardo was named, I hope he'll come on out, Ricardo. Ricardo was named one of Fortune magazine's 7 most powerful people in America's marijuana industry. He's a 25-year veteran journalist, and in 2016 launched his own agency, Grasslands, which works with businesses in both cannabis and psychedelics. Please welcome Ricardo Baca.
Thank you, Brad.
All right, you got it. Got it.
How about this, everybody? Psychedelics Business Conference. Welcome to Remind. It's so great to be here. I think I'm sitting over here, correct? My pleasure to welcome the panel. Everybody come on up, please. We only have 40 minutes, so we are going to make the best use of this time. And I'm going to let the panelists do a bit of a self-introduction. But before they do, just so you know where you are, we are here to talk about cannabis and psychedelics. Similar story, different trajectory. So with that said, why don't I kick it to you, Sean, to get us started with some self-introductions.
Okay. I've got 20 minutes, right, for the introduction. No, good morning, everybody. Sean McAllister. I think I'm listed as a legal pioneer. I don't remember saying that, but I am the kind of lawyer that stakes new grounds in new areas, and it's been 25 years of drug policy reform for me. Helping to write Amendment 64 and get it passed in 2012 in Colorado, helping to write Prop 122 and getting it passed last week. Yeah, let's give it up for the voters. I'm just one of those guys that has a personal story of healing and transformation from psychedelics, and it turns out cannabis was a gateway drug. It's a gateway to psychedelics. And I've completely changed my focus of my practice to psychedelics. So I advise therapists. I work for Naropa University. I've done work for MAPS. I'm working with companies that are seeking DEA licensure all across the spectrum of regulated state initiatives. I'm working, and it's an honor to be a part of this movement. And I look forward to sharing some of my experience today.
Thank you. Amanda.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to see so many people that I haven't seen in person in 3 years. I'm Dr. Amanda Ryman. I'm a social scientist, and I've been studying the evolution of cannabis in California for over 20 years. I've been growing my own cannabis for over 25 years. And I also have a company called Sacred Garden that focuses on the cultivation and conservation of psychedelic plants. So really focusing on the ability for us to grow our own and really planning for what might happen when all of a sudden everyone in the world wants access to psychedelic plants, and what does that mean for native plant populations. So happy to talk to folks about plants. But I'm really here to talk about cannabis. See, I've been in California, as I said, for over 20 years. I started studying the early medical cannabis dispensaries in the Bay Area in the early 2000s and got really excited about what the opportunity might be to introduce a new and novel business model around cannabis. I think a lot of us sitting up here are like, well, as Ethan said, people aren't going to jail. And that's really what it's always been about for me. So after lunch, I'll be moderating a panel about conscious capitalism, which may sound like an oxymoron. But I do think it's important for us to start where we're at in this country and the models that we've got, and then think about how we make them better. So I'm very excited about this conversation, and then I'll be seeing you again after lunch.
Excellent. David.
Greetings, everyone. I have a personal history with both cannabis and psychedelics, and having had back surgery, cannabis was a very helpful medicine in having trauma myself. And from that, it brought me into working in the industry. And because of that, I have developed a company that researches cannabis and psychedelics. And we also were able to get the first hemp microgreens approved, and we're offering those through Zeus Farms, another one of my companies. But through that, we've realized that reciprocity for people of color has been lacking in all of these industries. And one of the biggest pieces is that Panacea Plant Sciences has given 32% of our equity to indigenous groups and environmental groups that work with them. And part of that is because there's just been a lot of trauma to civilizations around the world, and it hasn't been taken care of. The other side of it is that I really respect the work that Amanda and others have done regarding all drugs being decriminalized because no one should be going to jail for any of that. The other side of it is that, on that regard, I worked with the FDA for the policy and the hearings for CBD, and then with the World Health Organization to speak out on kratom criminalization, and luckily we were able to turn back the World Health Organization's attempt to criminalize kratom, and then separately was able to stop the DEA's process to try and control and move to Schedule I tryptamines and phenethylamines that were psychedelics this year.
Props. Thank you, panel. Obviously a powerhouse panel. I'm honored to be here. I know Brad gave a brief intro, but in short, I was a journalist for 24 years, most recently as the cannabis editor at the Denver Post. Covered the implementation of regulated markets, and now for the last 6 years have been running Grasslands, which is a PR and marketing firm working in cannabis and psychedelics. So pleasure sharing space with all of you. So as the panel and I put our heads together to try and create the most compelling 40 minutes for all of you, we really developed and agreed upon a main thesis pretty quickly, and it's a thesis that many of you here are already familiar with. The thesis: the emerging psychedelics market and movement is not Cannabis 2.0. Right, yes. One more time for the people in the back. The emerging psychedelics movement and industry is not Cannabis 2.0. It's not to say that cannabis is good, psychedelics is bad, or vice versa. All of us just agreed that we wanted to start out with this so that everybody knows where we're coming from, because each of us and our partners have found this out the hard way. Put simply, you cannot make the same assumptions you made in cannabis while prepping to invest in or work in the modern psychedelics industry, because there are some very key differences between the two highly regulated markets, and these differences are very much what we're going to be dedicating most of our time to today. So before we dive deep into those very real differences, I wanted to start this panel by maybe taking a few brief moments to step back and recognize some of the biggest failures of the modern cannabis industry, because our hope being, if we take a moment to recognize where cannabis is struggling to be a better industry, perhaps psychedelics can learn to do things differently. So panelists, would love to hear each of your feedback. Let's keep it to one. Let's keep it high and bright and tight. Who wants to get us started?
I guess I'll kick off. Since this is something that most people don't talk about, is that often the state model system has been held up as an option that gives all these experiments to happen. But going back to indigenous groups and Native Americans, is that because Native Americans have their own nations and are sovereigns, basically if we don't legalize it federally, then they're restricted from those markets and they don't get to participate often. Many times the states will try and allow them to, and there's treaties and compacts between, well, not treaties technically anymore, they'd be considered compacts. But because of that, there's many Native Americans that get completely left out of this, and they're still being arrested for cannabis, while there's federal protections through various spending bills that protect people in states. So that's the one thing that I really strongly think we need to look at.
100.
Yeah, and also, I think we got lazy. And I think there was a reason for that. It was such a big lift to convince the public that cannabis wasn't this horrible thing that they had been taught for decades, that when we got to the regulation part, we were like, all right, it's now legal, now it's time for regulation. I think we kind of just collapsed into what we already knew business looked like. And part of that reason was because the public was expecting that, right? So the public was expecting that cannabis business and regulation and distribution was going to look like that old familiar model that they're used to seeing. But we did have an opportunity, based especially on how a lot of the early dispensaries were run, more as bottom-up community health service providers. We did have an opportunity to reimagine what regulation might look like. And at the end of the day, for the most part, we just didn't do that. We went to high marketing, we went to high volume, we went to focusing on the most intense consumers, we went to completely saturating marketplaces with dispensaries and with products, something that feels very familiar to us as Americans, but definitely did not honor the plant or the relationship that people would most get from the plant. So one reason why I'm really hoping that we can have this conversation now in psychedelics, and not after we've seen 7 or 8 states develop regulatory systems.
Yeah, it's so crazy important. And Sean, you and I were just talking backstage. I mean, sure, we as the voters, Colorado citizens, passed 122 last week, thank goodness. And next up becomes the hard work, the work that Amanda's talking about, the opportunity to regulate this in a different way. Before we get your one area, I know that you're one of the people who at the table. It's a massive responsibility, but can you speak a little bit to the responsibility and the work ahead, given what Amanda just shared?
Yeah, I totally agree with these last two comments. I also underline we haven't done social equity right in cannabis, and how is it going to be different in psychedelics? That relates to the implementation issue. My one big thing I think cannabis failed at was failure at the federal level to get respect and recognition. We're 26 years after initial legalization, and we're still federally illegal, still suffering with 280E, still having problems with banking. And what will psychedelics do that will be different, especially in these state-regulated systems? So that's just one comment about the failures of cannabis. But I mean, look, I was on the team that put together Amendment 64, just like I was with Prop 122. We did a hell of a better job getting community input and hearing from BIPOC communities and seeking out indigenous input, but we still probably failed in that mission because we come to the table already with a legacy of distrust. None of you and anybody in the world trust the government or big corporations or policy reform activists. And so when you put all those people in one room, we don't even know each other, we don't trust each other. And how are you going to make policy in divided communities that have essentially been pitted against each other to keep the status quo? I mean, that's why our own harshest critics in Colorado are the biggest legalization advocates. And so, yes, in the coming 2 years as we make rules in Colorado, my goal is to hear that community, to express psychedelic values and lean into the difficult issues and bring light to the challenges. But we are going to fail in certain ways in our regulatory models. And Amanda mentioned this, it'll be replicated in psychedelics. The question is, can we fail better? Can we fail less? And I think, I don't set that up that we can't do a great job. I'm just saying there's so many forces at play that to expect in one generation for us to transform Scheduled I substances into well-regulated, equitable industries with all of the cultural baggage and trauma that we bring to the table, it feels almost bigger than we're capable of, but we're going to try. But I just feel that there will be failures in the system, and that's why the input from all these communities, from entrepreneurs, from doctors, is so critical in this process. The applications are open now on the governor's website in Colorado. If you want to be on the advisory board, there's still a chance to be appointed.
Amanda, David, how from your perspective, how do we fail better? How do we fail less as we approach this next monolithic task of government regulation?
I think we need to be humble. I think we need humility. There's a lot of kind of exertion of power when we're trying to change laws and we're trying to completely change frameworks, but we have to listen more. We can't assume we know what to do, either because we worked in cannabis or because we've been using psychedelics for a long time. There's folks whose voices we need to listen to first. And I think if we do that, we're going to have a much better chance of failing less. But as Sean said, this is not like a 5-year thing where it's like, 5 years ago we legalized psychedelics and now everything's great. I don't even think it's a 10-year thing. One of the things Ethan used to tell us at Drug Policy Alliance, if you're a drug policy reformer, part of that work is planting seeds that you may never see grow. And so that's what we all have to admit. We have to be humble enough to say, you know what, I'm going to plant this seed, but then I'm going to hand it off and let someone else nurture this plant and grow it into what it can be. And I think everyone here on this stage is willing to play that role.
I think those are all really important. And then I think part of it is being open to additional ideas of how business and regulation and things can occur outside of what we're open to traditionally as a Western society. We're seeing, like Ariel mentioned, the public benefit corporations are taking hold and becoming more common in our society. I think one thing that could be really helpful is there's a thing called the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there's the Nagoya Protocol. And that being passed and adopted by the United States and Canada would go a long way. It's a document that basically is international law, and every country outside of North Korea, the Vatican, the United States, Canada, and Sudan have signed it. And basically it requires that you respect indigenous rights to plants and lives and animals and other objects, and that also then that you have to work with them to develop them, and then that will help protect the ecosystems and basically enshrine reciprocity for people of color. And so I think that being adopted by the United States could be a big way towards mandating these changes.
Appreciate all of that, friends. Now, let's talk about the consumers a little bit, because I find that in some of my conversations with colleagues, friends, clients who are thinking about getting active in this space, they're not thinking about this consumer, which is a very different consumer than we have in cannabis. So, who are the psychedelics consumers for these new regulated markets we're creating? Especially when you compare them to cannabis consumers, and how will their buying consumption patterns be different in this newer market? I know, Amanda, you have a lot of opinions about this.
I do have a lot of opinions about this, maybe because I've been studying cannabis consumers for so long. But cannabis is something that a lot of us experienced without someone helping us experience it, right? We got passed a joint at a party. Maybe someone gave us some cannabis at some point and maybe smoked it with us and told us how to light it and how to inhale. But there's a lot of self-discovery around cannabis that makes consumers fairly independent, right? They go into a dispensary, they may ask the bud tender a couple of questions, but they have a pretty good sense of the type of cannabis products they enjoy. Most people enjoy flower. Edibles are becoming more popular. But psychedelics consumers, don't necessarily have that education, and there's a higher risk to not knowing what you're doing. And so I think, seeking out healthy and positive psychedelics experiences isn't going to be just going and knowing what product to buy at the store. There's going to be a whole other set of knowledge that people are going to have in order to maximize benefit and reduce harm. And so I think that the consumers, not only are they coming into it less educated and less experienced than with cannabis, but they have different needs than just which is the best edible for me to buy, or which is the best flower, or what's on sale today, or what was grown locally. There's a whole other question about intention and mental health and set and setting. And so I think with psychedelics consumers, it's going to be a lot bigger lift to have them have that good experience. And the consumption rates are going to be different. I mean, microdosing aside, right? Because we just saw that microdosing, apparently people are microdosing every day, like everyone is microdosing. All of y'all are probably microdosed right now. So microdosing aside, because it is, a non-psychoactive experience, when we look at people that are using psychedelics for psychoactive experiences, they're not doing it 5 days a week. They're doing it maybe once a month. If they're doing it in therapy, it may be a few sessions in a month. But when we look at cannabis consumers, most regular consumers are consuming 4 to 5 times a day. So even just that difference in the intensity of consumption is going to warrant a different approach for consumers of cannabis versus psychedelics.
And of course, Sean, we're talking about a regulated market and an unregulated market. They will coexist and well beyond all of our lifetimes. But to Amanda's point, I think one of the really sexy opportunities a lot of people want to do is like, ooh, I have this idea for a psilocybin chocolate bar, whatever it might be. But, where is the consumer in the regulated market, and realistically, how often are they going to be buying? What data are you working with as you're writing or starting to write the regs for 112, 122?
Yeah, I get these calls all the time from the people who want to make the psilocybin chocolate bar to, the people that are making it, frankly. I mean, the largest open-air psychedelic market is actually in California, where you can buy branded psilocybin at unlicensed dispensaries all across California. And so that, that's there. But I used to have this joke to entrepreneurs: let me try to talk you out of getting into cannabis. And I'm going to try to modify that because I really want people in psychedelics. I want to develop a healthy market here. But boy, is it going to be challenging if you just believe the numbers that only 1 or 2% of people regularly use psychedelics compared to 20% of Americans who might regularly use cannabis. I think there's a market, 1/10 or 1/20th the size of cannabis, which puts Colorado maybe at $100 to $200 million market. And by the way, there's no brands. You're not going to have a branded product in Colorado. You're going to have maybe a branded store, but there's only 5 stores maximum per individual. So I think it's a very challenging environment, and the most likely place that people are getting access, is the unregulated market, and there's no accountability in that at all. I believe in that. I fought for it. I want home grow, and we have that in Colorado now. I want ceremonial use. I think that's my favorite place to find healing, and I think a lot of people will access it that way. But yeah, I think that's a small percentage. I do think the mass of society is looking at psychedelics as a medical thing, that we don't have shamans in the US, we have doctors who heal us. And so that's why people will be attracted to these therapeutic centers. That's why I think a regulated model is important, because people that would never go to a shaman are gonna go to a therapist or a healing center in a regulated market where they feel safe. And the hope is that you can catalyze change for a lot more people in that market than you ever would in the 5% of us that regularly, engage in psychedelic use in a ceremonial way. So, I'm not trying to talk people out of it. It's just going to be very challenging in any of these regulated markets with all those things I said earlier. And I think the use, like everybody's saying, 2-3 times in a year, you're not going to have somebody, using, microdosing. You're going to go to a center to microdose. I'm just not sure that functionally will work. Those people are probably getting access through unregulated sources.
I did some psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy over lockdown, which was really meaningful for me, through ketamine, through the regulated market. And now I'm entering the unregulated market with some more goodness in a basement session that's also been helpful. But David, as we think about this consumer and this consumer base, what are the other blind spots? What are we missing up here before we kind of move to business and investment?
Well, I think one of the things is it's kind of in the middle of this, and it's part of the next part as well, is that all the markets we're talking about kind of here, hinting about, are all still federally illegal. Yeah. So technically, although you can be in the state, like there's protections federally for not getting, cannabis businesses not getting rated. There's no protection for psilocybin or for any of this. So at any point, any of those businesses that is set up in California or Oregon or Colorado can be rated by the DEA at any moment. Yeah. And so that's one concern still to think about is that side, and that because of that, there's on the flip side is medical research happening, and that's DEA licensed for FDA approved therapies that are federally, this isn't fair, and I'm not saying this is how it should be, but this is how it is. You can just research and start doing clinical trials, and those drugs will probably be approved, and you'll be able to go to a doctor and get them in the next 2 years. And so you're having this interesting dichotomy where if a product exists, it's probably going to be, like Oregon only allows the fruiting body, pretty much. And then you have the other where it's going to be purified isolate. And so I think for the next 2 to 4 years, besides the gray market or whatever you want to consider that, those are going to be your only 2 options.
Well, we're already kind of leaning into that business side, so let's talk about some of the business opportunities, because, of course, in cannabis, we're talking about who's growing the best flower, making the best edibles, integrating the most strategic multi-state expansion plans. But in psychedelics, where is that business opportunity going to be? Amanda, will it be on the brand side, the therapy side, the ancillary side, somewhere else?
No, yes, yes. So yeah, as I said before, with psychedelics, there's a lot more preparation, integration, and support services that are needed for people to use them successfully. And so while I absolutely agree with social consumption for cannabis, I think it is a very important harm reduction tool. I think it's extremely important for equity for people who, no matter who they are, where they live, to be able to go and consume cannabis in a safe space. A lot of social consumption around cannabis is really just giving us space, right? It's saying, no one's gonna yell at you for smoking in here. You can sit here, you can sit down, you can relax. You don't have to look over your shoulder to see if you're gonna get in trouble, and you can just consume your cannabis. And most of the early dispensaries had that option because cannabis consumption was still so stigmatized that even in a place like San Francisco, people didn't wanna consume in their apartments, they didn't wanna consume outside. So dispensaries really played that role. Now, people consume in their home, social consumption's important, But with psychedelics, there's going to be a whole host of people that have never done psychedelics that are like, where do I start? So perfect example, my parents, I'm sure they won't mind me outing them. My parents are in their 70s and they did their first mushroom trip a few weeks ago, right? And so, they came to me because I'm in this field and I know what to tell them and how to create a set and setting and how to reduce the likelihood of a negative experience and increase the likelihood of a positive experience. But most people don't have someone close to them that works in psychedelics that they can ask. So these folks are going to need support. They're going to need to know what psychedelics do, how much they should take, how they should create an environment so that they have a beneficial experience and minimize harm, how they integrate that experience into their life afterward. And this isn't something that people are just born knowing. So folks that can provide this education, folks that can be that support system for people that are newer to psychedelics or revisiting psychedelics is going to be a huge part of the industry. Not to mention safe spaces to use psychedelics. So you're talking about basement sessions, right? So retreats, safe spaces where people can go and be supported during psychedelic use. This is all something that we are not inventing. This is how psychedelics are traditionally consumed. So this is a model that we really need to adopt so that we don't have people with bad experiences. Because as Ethan mentioned earlier, that pendulum does swing. And all we need is a whole bunch of 17-year-olds that get a hold of a ton of mushrooms and have a really bad experience that's highly publicized to see that pendulum start to swing the other direction. So it's not just about ensuring that people have good experiences, it's about ensuring the future of psychedelics by being responsible about how we introduce it to society.
It's so true. I mean, Sean remembers the first year of legalization in Colorado with cannabis, and there were a couple high-profile page one, tragedies that happened that were related, but not the root cause of. But Sean, you had something to add.
Well, I just wanted to say, I agree with what Amanda said earlier. Psychedelics is a service, cannabis is a commodity. And that's the difference between the two things. You can sell cannabis in a brand, people take it home. Psilocybin and psychedelics are going to be a therapeutic model, a service model. But also to expand on what Amanda said, this unregulated side is another competitor. I support the unregulated side, but think about this. In Colorado, when the governor certifies the election in the next couple weeks, it's going to be the largest legal psychedelic market in the world where people can charge for spiritual counseling and give away psychedelics. They can charge for a weekend retreat and give away the psychedelic legally under Colorado law. So, you're going to have an entire part of the market that what's the difference between cannabis and psychedelics? It was legacy operators in cannabis who stepped up, who knew how to grow, who had a relationship with the plant, and they're stepping into the regulation. In psychedelics, it's more sophisticated therapists, VCs that are starting, therapy companies. But those legacy people in psychedelics are going to end up in that unregulated space of ceremonial use, therapeutic use, spiritual counseling. And, it might be just like it is in cannabis where 40-50% of the market is that unregulated side. And I'm happy about that because I think there's a lot of great opportunities there and a lot of healing can happen, but I think people should be sober about that.
And David, from one indigenous human to another, I know how important the spiritual use is to you. How do you think these strange bedfellows, these different use cases are going to cohabitate and live alongside one another?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of indigenous rights and uses that need to be protected, like the Native American Church's use, and recently groups with that, who will be speaking later, Troy, for example, but others not connected with Troy have been meeting in DC regarding expanding access for the plant to be able to be accessed by the tribes, because currently they have to get that through the federal government through peyote licenses, and that's a little bit ridiculous. Well, no, a lot of it ridiculous. And so that's something that needs to change. And that additionally, something that I think is ridiculous regarding that is that Texas still has a blood quantum law for people who are of Native American descent to be able to pick and harvest it from the peyoteros. And so if you aren't at least a quarter Native American, you can't actually do it. So you can't even go access the medicine if you're not at least a quarter in Texas. Other states don't have that requirement, and so that's something that needs to change. But then I myself have a separate religious organization myself that's not related to indigenous rights. That's a church, And so I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to end up with a huge spectrum of these options because psychedelics inherently have a spiritual component, in my opinion, and healing is obviously a portion of that as well. And they healed me from PTSD and other issues that I've gone through. And I don't know if healing is the right word. It's still a process, or I guess healing is the right word, not cured. And so I think that, like I said earlier, is like allowing our society to integrate these other models rather than just a capitalistic model will be interesting, whether it's religious or just communal collectives, or there's just so many options, and I think we need all of it.
Without a doubt. Now, we talked about the consumers, we've talked about some of the business opportunities. I want to talk about investors, since I know we have quite a few of you in the room today. Investors are so essential to this pre-revenue market and the years ahead, but what might the differences between the psychedelics and cannabis markets mean for investors and how they approach this space? I mean, David, I know you're in the middle of a raise, so why don't you get us started?
It's a really interesting time with the economy right now, so. Outside of the chaos with global markets, which has been well, I guess I'll just touch on that. So right now, the economy and the interest rates going up is making it really difficult for public psychedelic companies, because getting a drug legalized or not legalized, but approved by the FDA, you're gonna spend $100 million low end. And so there's only maybe 2 or 3 companies that have that much value in their entire company, let alone the free capital to be able to do that. So that means they have to raise that capital. Well, good luck raising capital when interest rates are skyrocketing and you're heading into a recession. You've seen numerous psychedelic public companies be cutting including MindMed, Atai, others, cutting their pathways for drug marketing and public trials because of it, because they cannot afford to get these drugs to market, which means the majority of the companies are actually going to go under. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to have this kind of giant culling of the market right now, and which is a good thing in my opinion, because most of these companies don't deserve to exist. And I mean, it's just how it is, whether ethically or just not good marketing, not good strategy. So it's unfortunate, but it's going to happen, and it's been making it really difficult for us to raise. But the other thing is everyone's focusing on the mental health, but psychedelics, for example, phenethylamines are actually, in studies, are as beneficial as albuterol for asthma. And so that's something you could take like once a month and not have issues with asthma in early trials, or inflammation, or pain, or diabetes, cancer. And the other thing is that those have endpoints that are easily measurable, rather than depression, which is a score that's very subjective by humans, or anxiety, other things. Companies are having very hard times getting drugs approved because they're going after mental health. And I appreciate the benefits for that, but I think that addiction, again, a measurable outcome, and focusing on things like that will be how companies get drugs approved.
Appreciate that. Anything else quick to add from the investment point? We do have some audience questions I'd love to get to.
I'll just say that one challenge is, if you look at Colorado's result, we actually got 53.5%, so it was really closer earlier in the returns, but it's been growing. But that still suggests we have a real challenge for these other states. If Colorado will only go 53%, I mean, we were very aggressive with our initiative. But if you're thinking your company's going to start in Oregon and Colorado and go to California, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, all the likely states that would be next, I mean, it's going to be tough, is my point. These are going to be close elections. The public is not quite there yet. They know cannabis way better than they know psychedelics. And so, if your plan is a multi-state operation, I think you ought to be very patient.
Long runway. Yeah. Okay, a couple audience questions. Thanks for submitting these. Would you envision convergence between psychedelics and cannabis retail/medical dispensary or other buying channels?
Anybody? I thought you were trying to do it with a product, right?
Well, that's a mess. I think it's going to exist. How is it going to? I mean, eventually it'll exist. But the thing is with cannabis, for California even has specific laws that ban even CBD being sold in any, or if you sell CBD, you can't get a liquor license.
Yeah.
So so yes, but I think it's going to be like 10 years before the markets allow it legally in regulated markets anyway.
We're so fetishized about intoxicants that I don't see cannabis and psychedelics getting in the same room anytime soon. But long term, maybe they should. Maybe there should be a product. Cannabis is a great way to come down off psychedelics, by the way. So why are we keeping them separate?
There was a conversation in Canada on whether cannabis could cohabitate at retail with alcohol, which, I think we understand there's some problems with that, but for convenience sake, maybe. The next audience question is, what should third-party testing look like when it comes to decriminalizing psychedelics, similar to cannabis?
I love that one. And testing is something that's incredibly important because we need a safe market. The problems with fentanyl that were mentioned earlier is because we don't have an open market that allows testing. If testing was allowed, you can get reagent testing. Anyone here can order reagent chemicals, and you can get those at home, and they change different colors based on the drugs that are there, and you can identify fentanyl at home. You can identify other chemicals and identify which drugs you're using at home. You don't need a lab. It's not going to tell you everything, the amount they're there, but to identify things that are going to kill you, that's a very important tool. And so I think that it's something that we need drastically so people know what they're getting. Because the problem with chocolate bars and the problem with these candies is that you don't know what's in it. There's lots of synthetic psychedelics which are fine, but they don't have the same safety profile of dosing that natural compounds do. And you need to know how much of what you're taking. Because 15 milligrams and 50 milligrams you can't even eyeball that difference, but it will be drastically different in how long you're going to be under the influence.
Amanda, we hear from cannabis operators regularly that testing is a barrier to entry. What's your thoughts about this question?
Well, I completely agree. I mean, one of the big barriers to people using psychedelics is they're afraid. They've been impacted by the stories of people going crazy and never coming back and, having these kind of out of control experiences. It was definitely the biggest concern for my parents. And so I think folks are looking for something that is reliable, that is standardized. It's one of the reasons why edibles and beverages have really taken off in the cannabis market, is because someone smokes a joint and they have no idea, how potent it was or what it was going to do to them. With an edible, they're like, this is 2 milligrams. I know exactly what 2 milligrams does. And so I think we do need that. I mean, you look at just the different varietals of mushrooms and the difference between 2 grams of golden teacher versus 2 grams of albino penis envy is a very different experience. And so folks need to know that, and they need to be able to know what's going to happen and what that potency is going to look like. And they also need to know that it's safe. I mean, that's one of the biggest benefits of having a regulated market, is that you know what you are taking is been approved, and that if it isn't safe or it harms you, that someone has to answer for that. And so there's a liability question, right? If I eat a mushroom chocolate and have a really bad experience, is it because I did something wrong? Is it because the product was made wrong? And who answers for that if it was the product? So I do think we're going to have to bring in standardized testing if we're going to see mass adoption of psychedelics, partially because of the health and safety issues, and partially just because of the individual concerns and fears that people have around taking psychedelics in the first place.
Yes, but we failed in testing in cannabis because in some places it's too rigorous, and other places it's too light, so we have to learn the lessons and not let testing become this barrier to entry, like you said.
Yes, and love that method. This last audience question is for you, Sean. What law advice can you give to me who is interested in opening an integration practice? Any malpractice insurance issues?
Sorry. Of course, I mean, what I basically tell therapists is, look, if you want no risk, then you shouldn't be working in psychedelics. There is going to be risk in what you do by the nature of you breaking ground. There's even questions, obviously some people say preparatory work could violate your licensure requirements. Everybody says integration is fine, but I've gotten calls from therapists who are being sued by clients because they led them on a psilocybin journey on the side and it went bad, and then somebody gets sued. We live in a very litigious society with a lot of novice psychedelic users who might blame others for their bad experience. So I think just talk to a good lawyer, think about good disclosure forms, really screen your clients, because it's usually the problem client that you should have screened better and not worked with. Trust your instincts. Those are the people that are going to drag you up in front of regulators. And so proceed with caution. Protect yourselves at all times.
Good advice. And everybody, really quick, I was talking to Brad and Sarah last night. I was telling them straight up, this is the first Remind ever. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to be looking back at this day. We were in the room together. Amazing to share space with all of you. Incredible to share space with all of you, my friends. So thank you. Everybody, the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.